So welcome everyone who could join us today. It's Thursday, May 6th, 2021, and our regular webinar series this month has a topic of 5 key ways to improve information protection and governance for your organization. My name is Frank Ureña. I'm a principal architect with Oxford Computer Group. And so just do some introductions for those of you who may not be familiar with Oxford Computer Group, or OCG. If this is your first time joining us for one of our webinars, I'll keep this brief, just so you know who the organization is sponsoring and what my background is. OCG is an identity-driven systems integrator. We have an 18-year track record deploying identity and hybrid identity solutions, primarily across the Microsoft ecosystem. We've delivered 900 plus projects around the world, and we've also helped in deployment of over 7 million Office 365 seats. We've been Microsoft Identity Partner of the Year several times, and most recently in 2020, we're finalists for Microsoft Security Systems Integrator of the Year. I myself have been with Oxford for about 5 years, have 25 plus years in IT, systems integration, and then security. Focused in security for the past 5 years. And so we hope that this information will help you to understand information protection and governance at a high level. Obviously, we won't have time to deep dive, but we'll be talking primarily from a strategic standpoint with, at the end, next steps, our recommendations from a systems perspective, technology that can be used to help achieve your information protection and data governance goals. Our agenda, essentially the first 5 points you see there, those are the 5 key ways. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how improving your identity and access management strategy is sort of a foundational step in securing access to your data and governing that data. But we'll talk about why it's important to know your data, know what's in your environment. That's continues to be a big problem for many organizations that are producing data in vast amounts on a daily basis. Protecting your data, preventing data loss, governing your data, and then again, what our recommended next steps are. So data protection begins with identity. And of course, you've probably heard this said many times over the past year, but it is becoming critical that organizations get a handle on their identity. And identity, of course, means identity of individuals who are accessing systems and data repositories in your environment. But of course, identity also comes into play when we talk about devices, and not only employees, but also contractors, your business partners, your customers. Do you know what state your identities are in? As far as your devices are concerned, are they being managed or are they unmanaged devices? Application management policies become important for how users are accessing that data from mobile devices. When they're not in the office, which of course, past year we've all not been in the office, so it's become more and more important to understand how identities are being used in your environment. So knowing the health of your environment becomes important and becomes critical before trying to establish an information protection and governance strategy. And there are other tools that can be used, continuous monitoring as part of an overall zero trust framework. Continuous monitoring is one of the tenets of a zero trust framework, making sure that connections to your environment, sessions that are being held, are being monitored on a continuous basis for any changes, for anomalies, for instances where a user is roaming and changing their location. Do you have those policies in place to ensure that that identity is being proofed up when when the environment changes. There are, of course, CASB solutions or cloud access security brokers, which are becoming crucial for organizations today, since a lot of our data now exists in the cloud, where without any kind of auditing, monitoring, reporting, it could be very easy to lose access to that data and not know where it lives. And the CASB solution can, of course, help shore that up. And then, of course, being able to audit and report on your sign-in activity, being able to have that data exported or sent to a SIEM solution that can easily provide you with that information in the event of an incident where you may need to report on what occurred in the environment. Protecting and governing access, as we know, as mentioned, since for some time, not just this past year, but for quite some time, we've of course had a mobile workforce where the firewall and proxies no longer are the principal way of securing access to the information. So some pointers on being able to protect and govern access to the environment and critically to the data that lives in that digital estate. We wanted to make sure you're enabling strong authentication. It's again stated many times, but enabling MFA, two-factor authentication, is crucial to any zero trust framework and strategy. Just simply trying to ensure that your identities are being kept safe and you are keeping infiltrations into the environment at a minimum. Enforcing intelligent access policies through contextual or conditional access policies that many of the mainstream identity providers can now provide and can do, of course, is critical. You want to, of course, set these up so that users remain productive and they are not being stopped at the gate, as it were, and asked for their being checked for their ID, as it were, constantly, but have the appropriate policies in place so that, again, when the environment changes, the device you're using changes, the nature of the sign-in changes, because now a lot of these policies are being driven by machine learning that can detect anomalies in the way a user even types their password, right? And to be able to detect if it's a legitimate access or authentication attempt or a script that is attempt net access. Those intelligent policies are able to do that. So if you have the means to implement those, either through your identity provider or some other means, to ensure that, make sure that those are enabled as well. Secure access to your apps with automatic provisioning and deprovisioning becomes important. So this is part of the identity lifecycle management, making sure that you have as much automation in that identity lifecycle to avoid human error, input errors, data entry errors into the environment, and many of the tools, many of the mainstream identity provider solutions that are cloud-based now, of course, can do automated provisioning to other third-party SaaS applications through common protocols like SCIM, but also for hybrid identity, for those that still have a vast landscape on-premise, making sure that that same identity is able to be provisioned to Active Directory or other directories that are being used in the environment for allowing access and authorization to those on-premise applications. And of course, as part of that protect and governing access strategy, you want to have continual monitoring and auditing of that access, so we can ensure that the right people were accessing the information that they needed and no more, and of course no less, because you want them to be productive and be able to get to the information that they need. So some key objectives as far as your identity and access management solution or strategy. Aim for a goal of having one digital identity per individual and per device, and once established, maintain the identity through a mature identity access lifecycle. So from birth all the way to the termination of that identity, in the typical join, remove, or leaver process, have a mature identity lifecycle process in place to ensure that identity is being maintained and kept secure. And for your access management systems, you want to add a layer of protection that ensures consistent application of access rules and policies. So that's part of an identity governance landscape as well. And there's third-party systems that are able to do that. If you're a Microsoft shop, of course, there's Azure IGA now Azure AD IGA that can perform a lot of those functions to be able to manage access to applications, provide an access request system so that users are able to request access to applications that they need through an automated process, and again, be productive, but also maintain the appropriate access rules. And another step, of course, is to reduce the complexity and cost of protecting those user credentials. So one strategy along those lines is adopting modern password guidance. Many systems, of course, still require passwords, but as much as we'd love to be able to get rid of them all, passwords are going to be here for some time. But there are modern password guidance. NIST released guidance a few years ago, 2016. Basically kind of upending what we had known, for the prior 13 years or so regarding password complexity and rotation rules and history rules, to now making it so that users do not have to try to come up with complex passwords that they're going to just keep written down on a Post-it note under their keyboard, which just makes everything insecure. Or be constantly forgetting that password and having to call the help desk for assistance to reset that password, right? We want to try to grease the skids, as it were, and make it easy for the user to be able to log in. And of course, one way to do that is by just ensuring that multi-factor authentication is turned on in the environment. And of course, another way to do that, start thinking about, is migrating to passwordless authentication methods. Right? So that's one way to start that journey of getting rid of passwords in the environment. For those that are in a Microsoft-centric environment, there's Windows Hello for Business on the devices that can do that. There is passwordless sign-on if you're using Azure AD as your identity provider. It's now supported so that users no longer even have to enter a password in order to access the environment that they're using. They can get a prompt on their authenticator device on their phone, or use hardware security keys to access the environment. And of course, we want to make sure that we're empowering users to be productive from anywhere, and these steps can help do that, so that they're able to do their jobs, get access to what they need from anywhere and on any device, but at the same time keeping that identity secure. So the second of the 5 ways that we're talking about, of course, is knowing your data. And this brings us to the topic of the risk of dark data in your environment. So we're going to cover questions such as, why it's important to know everything about the data in your organization, why you should be concerned about protecting and managing that data, the risks of not being compliant are some of the topics that we'll discuss. So we know data is exploding. We live in a time where digital technology is impacting our lives, from the way we connect with each other to how we interpret the world, and we're facing a tsunami of data in the environment. In fact, IDC estimates that by 2025 we'll create and replicate over 163 zettabytes of data, which represents 10 times the amount of data that was being created in 2016, just 5 years ago. In the past, many organizations mainly had to deal with documents and emails in the environment, but now you're dealing with instant messages, text messaging, video files, images, and of course, the IoT also is adding to the explosion of data. So it's obvious that it's critical to ensure that we're able to meet the complex requirements around protecting this data and remaining compliant. But it's become challenging because of the way new people are working, the new ways that people are working, and creating sharing data across boundaries, right? Data no longer just remains within the enterprise, but we're sharing it with our business partners, we're sharing it with customers. And so we need to be able to understand what is there, where it exists, who's using it, right? And now we also know that we need to be able to protect that sensitive information across multiple devices, SaaS applications and other cloud services, in addition to our legacy on-premises environments. Along with that, the ever-increasing amounts of data that's being generated is the amount of data that's being collected by organizations around the world, which is raising privacy concerns, and that could also impose a threat on organizations with respect to regulatory compliance. So as you see in this slide, this is just a sample of different countries around the world and the various different compliance regimes that exist, the regulatory regimes that exist that your organization may be subject to and would have to be compliant with. So questions to ask yourself are, do you know if you are required to retain the data? What can happen to your organization if the data is leaked or exposed? And are you deleting data that you do not need anymore? And if you don't, is that increasing your liability? Because data is power, as shown from all these various regulatory schemes, governments want to ensure that they're doing something to protect individuals' privacy. Collecting customer data, of course, is a core part of many businesses. You need information from the customers you're dealing with, from the basics like their addresses, if you're shipping product to them, to more sensitive information, personally identifiable information, dates of birth, credit card numbers, social security numbers, things of that nature. So of course there is a great need in making sure that data remains secure. Regulations are creating a need for responsible usage of personal data, and not complying with regulations like GDPR, as an example, can result in fines, withdrawal of licenses, and lower credibility with regulators and customers. The increase of BYOD, or bring your own device, and cloud adoption, that's increased. That's been increased in organizations around the world, has also led to a greater chance of data theft or data loss. We know all of the recent data breaches. I won't go through all of them here, but you see, it seems like every week there's one massive data breach or another. I just got myself personally on Sunday checking my email that Park Mobile, which makes an app that keeps information in an app for parking around New York City, as an example, where I'm located, or near where I'm located, they were breached, right? So information such as my name, my cell phone number, my license plate tag were all part of this breach and this data dump that's now being circulated around the dark web and being sold to organizations. So we know the importance of protecting that data. So do you have a strategy for protecting and managing sensitive and business critical data in your environment? And remember, this is about protecting the information wherever it goes. And we know that it is traveling outside of the confines of our enterprise firewalls, right? It's no longer safe as it might have been in the past or seemingly safe on our SIF shares or file shares in our environment, or our SharePoint libraries that we kept on our servers in our data center. No, that information is being stored in third-party cloud services and being emailed links are being sent to it for other business partners or other entities that are outside of organizations to use. And so the question that we hear a lot is, how can I implement a strategy for protecting and managing sensitive information? How do I even know where our sensitive data resides? And that seems like a simple question, but it becomes a complex issue for organizations of just about any size. So understanding where all of your sensitive information is can be a huge project all on its own. The second question is, do you have control of your data as it travels both inside and outside of your organization? When it gets shared with customers and partners via email or SharePoint sites or OneDrive or other third-party data repositories like Box and Dropbox, do you have access to it? Do you still have control of that information? And lastly, are you using multiple solutions to classify, label, and protect sensitive data? Many enterprises are doing that, and they're finding that it's just a disjointed set of solutions that don't work together well, if at all. So it can be a challenge to discover that data. 88% of organizations saying that with the amount of data growing exponentially and that data existing everywhere, it's becoming harder and harder to track it, to have confidence that it's not been lost, either intentionally by an insider threat or by accident. Before you even start thinking about managing and protecting your data, are you even capable of finding it where it exists? 80% of corporate data is dark, and meaning it's unstructured data, and it's unknown if that data is going to pose a risk somewhere down the line. And so it becomes very difficult to protect that data if you don't know how sensitive it is. And that's kind of the first step, right? Knowing your data, knowing what exists in the environment, what is sensitive, what needs protecting, and what should no longer be there. We'll touch on that a little bit in the rest of the presentation. 83% of companies experience direct compliance readiness effects. They're having challenges in ensuring regulatory and industry compliance, and they find that they have an ineffective management scheme when it comes to managing that data. So the risks of not being compliant. So, for instance, GDPR is one that was talked a lot about when it came into effect back in 2018. And the first thing that comes up, of course, is the fines that can be imposed on organizations for failure under GDPR. But of course, it's not just the fines that's the most important risk of being out of compliance. There's the loss of trust. For those organizations that have had breaches, think of most recently the Facebook breach that was kind of rediscovered because it was not a new data dump of 553 million Facebook users' information were found in the database that was being again circulated around, sold for information, contained information such as email addresses and phone numbers. Many users perhaps no longer felt like it was worth the risk of having an account, so they may have deleted their account because of that. Could that happen to you if you have a breach and you're out of compliance? Will customers no longer trust you and want to keep their information with you? Of course, compliance, if customers don't trust you with their data, they won't do business with you. And being compliant with applicable regulations and standards is becoming the basis now for doing business. Many customers will say, if you're not complying with the rules, we don't even talk. Of course, a byproduct of that is the reputational damage. If a breach happens, your name will be in the news and it will damage reputations and diminish trust. And organizations, no organization wants to be remembered as the one that got breached and were the reason why their name was in the news, right? I think back to an employer I worked for, a boss who was a business owner, small business, but part of a supply chain, worked with very large pharmaceutical companies. And even though he was a small business, he did as much as he could to make sure that his systems were in place, that we had the best security that he could afford, because he was dealing with these large organizations. And he would always tell his clients, you know, my job is to make sure that you don't end up on 60 Minutes, right? Because of something I did or didn't do in terms of protecting the information that he had access to and that existed on the systems that we were managing. So that, again, you know, that reputational damage becomes important in trying to remain compliant. And we mentioned the fines. You know, those fines are significant and can be very costly down the road. So knowing the amount of data that data is ever increasing and understanding the risks that it can impose on your organization, it's important to start thinking about the solutions to mitigate and reduce the compliance risks of your data. It's important to not only look at data protection and governance, but to broaden the scope to also include risk management, discover and respond, and compliance management. Compliance can have different meanings to various teams across an enterprise, but essentially it's the outcome of compliance is continuous risk management, and it involves compliance, risk, legal, privacy, security, IT, and often even HR and finance teams to all be on the same page. Information protection and governance helps you to understand your unstructured data better, protect and govern that data throughout its life cycle in heterogeneous environments. Knowing what sensitive data organizations have, putting flexible and user-friendly policies in place for both security and compliance outcomes, and using more automation and intelligence. And that becomes key, because trying to do this manually is an uphill battle and very difficult to do. Internal risk management, of course, is important. You want to make sure you're mitigating against those internal risks, such as the Snowdens that might be in the environment. But that's usually, those internal risks are what are keeping business leaders up at night, regardless of being just negligence or malicious. Identifying and being able to take action on internal risks is critical. So being able to have rich signals and insights that provides the ability to quickly identify and manage risks from insiders, which could be employees, contractors with corporate access to information, and minimizing the negative impact on corporate compliance, competitive business position, and brand reputation, which is now a priority for organizations worldwide. Discover and respond. So when something happens, you want to be able to discover relevant data for internal investigations, litigation, and regulatory requests, and respond to them efficiently. And doing so without having to use multiple solutions and moving data in and out of systems to increase risk. That is also critical as well. And finally, compliance management is a fundamental to simplifying risk assessment and mitigation in a more automated way, providing visibility and insights to help meet compliance requirements. So having discovered your data, you know what's there, you have an idea of what needs to be protected. We move to the second key way to protect the information. That's simply protecting your data. But what does that mean? How do you start that process? Well, protecting that data, now that you know that it's there, of course, you want to start classifying and labeling those data assets. You've discovered you have some sensitive information in the repository, in the SharePoint library, in a cloud-based third-party solution. So now, of course, it becomes important to start tagging that information. So, for instance, Microsoft 365 uses sensitivity labels. With those labels, you can enforce protection settings such as encryption or watermarks on labeled content. You can protect content in Office apps across different platforms and devices. You can prevent sensitive content on devices running Windows from leaving the organization. You can protect the content in third-party apps and services as well. Essentially, that protection becomes persistent. It stays with that data asset no matter where it's traveling, no matter where it's stored, so that you can ensure that only the people who need access to it have access to it. And you can always revoke access to that information because of having a good classification and labeling scheme in place in the environment, so that you can see where in the world it is and be able to revoke that access to somebody that should no longer have access to that information. That last bullet point there, classifying content without using any protection settings. One of the capabilities, of course, is that you can classify information because there's going to be information that doesn't need any protection. It might be personal data. When I say personal, just an email about the company luncheon or barbecue, or information that an employee may use to send, receive information or send information that is not critical to the organization. So there's going to be some labeling that, of course, does not need to have any protection settings applied to it. But you have that flexibility. And of course, in starting any kind of project, and I'll move to the next slide, the 3 effective ways to do that is defining those labels. When doing so, you want to use common words and terms that make sense to the users. So for instance, with Microsoft 365 sensitivity labels, it uses words like personal, public, general, confidential, highly confidential, right? We've seen some organizations adopt terms and words or phrases that may make sense to an HR team, a legal team, but would not make any sense to the users that actually have to see those labels and potentially being applied, applying those labels manually to that data. So your first and foremost in setting up an effective classification and labeling strategy is to use simple terms. Then you want to define what each label does, right? With those protection settings, or I should say, which labels are providing some sort of protection on that data asset. Is it configured to provide encryption, or is it simply providing a header and a footer to that document, a watermark, to show that where it came from, or what the classification label is for that asset. And then you want to define who can see the labels. Certain groups may need to see highly confidential labels, whereas the rest of the organization does not. They may stop at just confidential. So you're able to, of course, ensure that only the people that need, higher level access can apply labels to data assets that require them. So the next step, once you've discovered your data, you know where it is, you know what needs protecting, you've started a classification labeling scheme to apply those labels to those data assets. Now the next step is preventing data loss. So any kind of DLP solution is going to ensure that information is not accidentally or intentionally leaked from the organization. So you do that with policies. So you want to make sure you define those policies, define that sensitive data that you're trying to protect. And then before you start creating policies with your actual solution, that your DLP solution that you may have in place, you want to create use cases and scenarios for all the different types of data that's in use. So for instance, the types of data might be credit card information, PII information, could be mergers and acquisitions, notes about M&A and contracts regarding that you don't want leaked out before it's time to do so. You want to look at the formats, how that data exists. Is it Office documents, Word, Excel, PowerPoint presentations? Is it PDFs? Is it other third party, right? Identifying that becomes important before you start creating an actual DLP policy around that. The locations of that data, right? Is it sitting on the file share, on the server? Is it at a cloud service, like OneDrive or Dropbox? Is it in SharePoint libraries? And then also the life cycle. How is that data being produced? How is it maintained? How is it archived? Is it ever deleted? Who determines when it's deleted? Also is an important and critical part of setting up these DLP policies. And that last step, the life cycle, also figures into governing your data as well, which we'll talk about as our last point. But once you have those use cases and those scenarios identified, then you can start creating the DLP policies to prevent that intentional release with that insider threat or accidental exposure. And where it's now important to use a single unified solution for that, like Microsoft 365, becomes important because those DLP policies can work across a variety of different solutions. It can prevent data loss through email, the DLP policies in conjunction with your sensitivity labels, right? You can now set up policies to ensure that data is not accidentally leaked through email, or using Cloud App Security, which is the Microsoft CASB solution. Can use that same DLP engine to ensure that that data is not being copied down from a trusted repository like SharePoint or OneDrive that the organization is using to an unmanaged device. Right, the CASB solution can do that, but it's using the same DLP policy, so you don't have to recreate that policy across multiple solutions. So those are just some thoughts to consider when evaluating, a vendor or provider for these solutions. Are they able to work across various scenarios, various use cases, again, without having to duplicate the effort? The fifth and final step, of course, is governing your data. So when researching this, one of the questions I came up with, first of all, is, does your organization have a clearly defined data governance strategy? Now, broadly speaking, if you looked up data governance, went out there and binged it, you would find multiple answers to this. But I found one from the Data Governance Institute that breaks it down to data governance being a practical and actionable framework to help a variety of data stakeholders across any organization identify and meet their information needs. Essentially, it's just having a framework in place across various groups, understanding who owns the data, who's producing the data, where does the data exist at rest, is there a chance for the data to be in transit, and then who's the recipient of that data on the other side, right? All of that needs to be clearly defined as part of a governance strategy, data governance strategy in your environment. And to do that, of course, requires more than just systems. So we're not talking about technology. We're not talking about a particular system in here. It involves establishing rules, processes, procedures, and ensuring that those rules are being followed consistently across the enterprise on a daily basis. And it does not fall to the responsibility of IT or InfoSec to set up those rules, of course. These are cross-functionality groups with the right expertise, with the right people who understand the data that can make those data-related decisions. As an analogy, IT provides the plumbing. The data is the water flowing through that plumbing. If you had a situation where your water was poisoned or had some lead in it, you wouldn't necessarily call a plumber to work out that problem for you, right? They only take care of the pipes. You would need an expert who understands the properties of water, how to test it, how to ensure that it's safe to drink. So similarly, individuals who have the expertise in managing the data, understand the data, they know what's there, are those that you're going to call. So that's going to be legal, risk, compliance, HR, finance, are all going to have a seat at the table in order to come up with a good data governance strategy for your organization. Now, if we bring it a little closer, though, we'll talk about an information governance. Information governance, both from a tactical standpoint, but also specifically when we're talking about Microsoft solutions around information governance. It's related to how, those policies and procedures that also determine how data in the environment is retained, how it's removed, how it's archived, right? That's one facet of an overall data governance strategy. And having consistent and effective retention policies is about keeping the data that is needed in the environment and removing that data that could put you at risk. And that's something a lot of organizations do not do. They may have a strategy around protecting that data, classifying, labeling it, making sure that it's secure wherever it goes, but they really haven't come up with a strategy and a procedure around deleting data that's no longer there. I mean, statistically speaking, most data, as soon as it's created, will be stale within 30 days. It really no longer needs to be retained in the environment. So understanding that and having policies and procedures in place to remove that data or retain the one that needs to, retain the data that needs to be kept, it also becomes an important part of the strategy. Of course, data retention policies help in decreasing your attack surface and minimizing your compliance risks. And that's what Microsoft Information Governance, or MIG, is able to provide. So those were our 5 points. I want to just give, in closing here, how you can start. So Microsoft has several workshops, and as a partner with Microsoft, we participate in conducting these workshops. And one of the most recent workshops that Microsoft is providing is a compliance workshop, the data risk and data risk management. With this engagement, usually about 3 days, engagement spread over the course of a couple of weeks. It's designed to help organizations understand the risks of their dark data, right? We talked about all that data that's being produced. So this workshop has tools and procedures in place that allow us to help you as a customer enable the automation of these discovery tools, right? Discover your compliance risks of your existing data. Assess your environment. If you're currently a Microsoft 365 environment, it can help assess that. If you're not a Microsoft 365 customer, but we're looking into perhaps looking into the Microsoft solutions, is a good opportunity to sort of do a trial and see if the solutions are going to work for you. And of course, these workshops are at no cost to customers. They're provided by Microsoft, and we as a partner conduct these again at no cost to the customer. The data risk check, which is an integral part of an activity of the compliance workshop, is able to see and surface hidden compliance risks in the environment. The data risk check leverages Microsoft 365 tools and services in that automated process that will help discover data that is stored in the Microsoft cloud and analyze it for artifacts that may impose a compliance risk to the organization. The Compliance Manager, which is a service that Microsoft provides, helps assess customers' environments against a set of controls for key regulations and standards for data protection and general data governance. And then the Analyze and Report portion of the activity uses an automated discovery process that will run for about 2 weeks, and it can crawl through the existing organizational data while searching for content that can impose a compliance risk. So finding information such as credit card information, other financial data that might exist in those documents that could be exposed, PII information, or if you're under the other regulatory schemes, right, being able to check your data against those regulatory compliance schemes and help you understand where you might be out of compliance and where you can improve in that regard. And then finally, based on the recommendations, or based on the findings and the compliance risk, being able to provide recommendations and next steps that you should take. This is a build out slide. I'll just go ahead and build it out here. So these are the 5 buckets. Oops, I went too far. The 5 buckets I mentioned: data risk check, and being able to look across the environment and see where you might be at risk. The data protection baseline assessment using Compliance Manager was able to assess the environment against a set of controls. That discovery session will help us as a partner, understand your needs from a strategic perspective. So there'll be a lot of Q&A in that regard, and taking of information to understand your digital estate, your data landscape, to better provide you with information that is going to help in instituting an information protection strategy in the environment. The Microsoft Compliance Overview again looks at your compliance vision and outlines Microsoft's approach to providing integrated compliance, and then providing those recommendations and next steps. And this is just drilling down a little bit further into the data risk check. There's 3 main activities. It's enabling and configuring all the services that are required for the automated discovery in the environment, running that automated process for 2 weeks, and then analyzing and reporting on the findings. And this is a rough outline of what the engagement looks like, starting with a pre-engagement call, preparing the environment for that data risk check, doing that automated discovery, preparing the reports, decommissioning anything that was put into the environment, of course, as part of this, if it was just for a trial purpose. And then, as you see in day 3, is where a lot of the time is spent in establishing that data protection baseline, doing the discovery session, and presenting the findings from the data risk check and the Microsoft Compliance Overview. So if you are interested in taking advantage of the compliance workshop, data risk management, feel free to reach out to us at Oxford. We'd be happy to have that discussion with you and set up the workshop in the environment, which include setting up any trial licenses that may be needed if you're currently not licensed for any of the Microsoft solutions. With that, I thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you on our next webinar.